Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first talk for the Just Infrastructure's Fall 2021 Speaker Series. My name is Carrie Karahalios, and along with Anita Chan and Indi Gupta, my fellow co-leads of the Just Infrastructures Initiative, we will be your hosts for today's event.
For those of you who don't yet know us, Just Infrastructures is an initiative created by researchers to interrogate the complex interactions between people, algorithms, and AI-driven systems. You can learn more about us and see more information about our next event with Fernanda Villegas and Martin Wattenberg of Google's Data Visualization Group and Harvard University on September 29th at our website at just-infras.illinois.edu. A link has been added to the chat, and you can see our full fall calendar of talks and last spring semester's recordings there too.
We want to thank our funders, the Computer Science Department, the School of Information Sciences, the Granger College of Engineering's SRI, Capital One, and the Community Data Clinic for supporting this programming. We have a long list of non-financial co-sponsors you can see on our website and whom we also want to thank.
To ask a question, you can use the Q&A box. We will go through the questions at the end of the talk. Closed captioning and American Sign Language support are also available. You can request tech support in the chat. Please do not use the chat for Q&A, use the Q&A box. This talk is recorded. We are also live tweeting this talk with the hashtag #JustInfrastructures, capital J, capital I.
I'd like to now ask you to join me in a land acknowledgement. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists and exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose lands it is located.
We are currently on the lands of several nations, including Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Ottawa, South, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to begin the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Acknowledgements invite us to ask, what does it mean to live in a post and neo-colonial world? What did it take for us to get here? And how can we be accountable to our part in history?
We'd now like to turn it over to our esteemed presenter. We're extremely honored to have Dr. Mary L. Gray with us here today. Dr. Gray is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, faculty associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and faculty at the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University. She chairs the Microsoft Research Ethics Review Program, the only federally registered institutional review board of its kind in the tech sector. An anthropologist and media scholar by training, Dr. Gray's books include Out in the Country, Youth, Media, and Queer Visibility in Rural America, and most recently, Ghost Work, How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass, co-authored with computer scientist Siddharth Suri, which was named a Financial Times Critics Pick and awarded the McGannon Center for Communication Research Book Prize in 2019. Her research has been widely covered by The Guardian, El País, The New York Times, Nature, The Economist, and Forbes magazine, among others. She currently sits on several boards, including the California Governor's Council of Economic Advisors and Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research. In 2020, Dr. Gray was named a MacArthur Fellow for ample contributions to the study of technology, digital economies, and society. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Gray.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I want to acknowledge that the land that I am occupying and all of the terror and violence that surrounds us today. I wish it was historical. And you know, I'm coming to you with a talk that's very much raw for me. It's the most recent work I've been doing really since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm going to share some insights that's very much collaborative work. Even though I'm speaking for it today, I'm hoping that I'm channeling my collaborators. So let me begin with a bit of definition for today's talk. And a bit of a roadmap as well. So why do I want to pick on scale? And then I want to think about what happens to scaling and the urge to move quickly when we're in a pandemic, and look at particular technologies that came to the fore and galvanized the tech sector at the beginning of the pandemic. In many ways, the research I've been doing in today's talk is both a love and a hate letter to my colleagues. And I want to think about what might be a different way of approaching not just the pandemic, but what it means to build with society and accountability in mind. And then lastly, I want to leave you with some thoughts for where we might go. What I think I might be working on right now is a theory of mutuality for computer science and engineering. So first, to scale. I'm mostly sidestepping the word banality for this talk. I'll just say, yes, I am referencing Hannah Arendt's work. I am not calling computer science and tech itself inherently evil. And in fact, I think that's an important lesson from Arendt, is that there's nothing inherent about evil. There are not evil people. There are practices that become ubiquitous. And banality thrives in this ubiquity. It's action without thought. That is the true villain in any of our stories. And I believe that ubiquity suggests scale. So it gives me a chance to think about this term scale that has come to mean success in most computer science and engineering, and particularly when it transfers to commercial tech environments. So on scale, I'm inspired by the work of anthropologist Anna Singh. Anna Singh had said, if the world is still diverse and dynamic, it's because scalability never fulfills its own promises. So the promise of scale, we hope, always falls short, precisely because in scaling something, you're erasing the existence of the very difficult, often human work that goes into making things seem frictionless. And when I'm thinking about scaling software, I'm drawn to the work of Fred Brooks. He is a computer scientist and software engineer. And he noted that, quote, the programmer builds from pure thought stuff, concepts, and very flexible representations thereof. Because the medium of software is tractable, we expect few difficulties in implementation, hence our pervasive optimism. Because our ideas are faulty, we have bugs. Hence, our optimism is unjustified. I started there with those definitions because my argument for today, and I'm going to be looking down at notes as I speak with you, my sense is that software development begins with abstraction, particularly in moments where it seems as though there's never been something built before, and there's an open sky, a blue sky that can inform software developers. In many ways, it's an art and science of engineering the material from immaterial thought. But rather than ground itself in material conditions and reality, it suggests that refusing the impulse to look at the real is the beginning of true imagination. And I'm thinking about how abstraction is the reason why so many specific projects, or at least the application of technology, seem to go awry, seem to fail. And I want to use this particular experience of watching the deployment, the development, the deployment of digital contact tracing and exposure notification software and schemas as a way of exploring what might be incompatible about a rubric or a notion of scale in the face of social problems. Because if you think about the beginning of software, so much of its development presumed a closed system of sorts, that you were effectively building for a very prescribed situation, but that situation had universals, that people were effectively hot swappable, that locations, one firm or another, really didn't matter. And importantly, that in an abstraction, you could effectively transcend anything that might be perhaps a hiccup. You'd be able to identify what was the wrinkle along the way that could be corrected, thus that optimism. I want to suggest that a way forward is to see that there is not scalability before us, but the opportunity to see the very particular expertise that could inform what we build and iterate what we build from the very beginning. That in fact, software development requires deep connection to subject matter expertise, domain expertise. And I'll return to those terms at the end of this talk. So, to the case of contact digital tracing as an example of the failure of scalability as an organizing principle for computer science and engineering when it's building for society's needs. You might be familiar with the story of the Google and Apple exposure notification schema, GAIN, that it was heralded as an unprecedented cooperation and relationship between two rivals coming together for society. And in many ways, the notion of contact tracing was not new. It was borrowed from the existing practices of contact tracing, which inherently mean you have somebody who's connected to someone who might have a contagious disease, and that person who's connecting to them can effectively find out from that individual who they've been near, so that those near them can be notified that they may have come into contact with somebody who has a contagious disease. My own personal experience with contact tracing actually goes back to the 90s. I was part of a group in San Francisco called the Stop AIDS Project. And much of our work was focused on thinking about how you would reach out to people who might be HIV positive and help them understand how their status could affect others. And most importantly, how communities could start communicating around the possibility of contagious diseases, not to isolate the person who might be sick, but to identify how you would, as a community, come forward to support those who might need help. So the notion of contact tracing that Apple and Google were building on is a well-established practice in community health and public health. It traditionally requires a lot of legwork. It requires somebody who's talking with someone and has the domain expertise of a health professional to be able to talk with a person who's been exposed to a contagious disease and find out who they've been in contact with recently. As you can imagine, that's delicate work, particularly if someone who's been exposed is afraid, may be afraid of the disease itself, but also might be afraid of the authorities who are asking them for more information about their identity. So exposure notification as an approach was something that had rolled out in other countries, most notably successfully to some degree in South Korea, Singapore, and parts of mainland China. But in all of those settings, it had a particular advantage that those in the US developing exposure notification did not see. So when the effort to create exposure notification software in the United States began, it really was assuming that you could snip off a contagious individual from a larger group without ever having parties know each other. Importantly, the notion of contact tracing and digital contact tracing itself assumed that the higher order goal was that you wanted to protect a person who was healthy from somebody who was sick, rather than identifying somebody who might be sick who needed help. And stepping into the maw of the distance between somebody who's sick and healthy, the assumption was that there was a public healthcare system that would be able to bridge the gap. That in fact, the digital contact tracing apparatus did not need to care about the person who was sick. So embedded in the notion of digital contact tracing is a color blindness that presumes I do not need to see who is sick. And in the United States, that becomes critical to understand and connect to who was getting sick by the time digital contact tracing was well underway. In most cases that were coming to the fore by April of 2020, when Apple and Google announced their joint partnership, putting this digital notification schema, making it available on both Android and Apple phones. Most of the people who were falling to the disease were part of Black and Brown communities in the United States, particularly people who had risk because of their occupation and people who were in settings where there were very few opportunities to reach support around immediate care. Of course, it was early in the pandemic, so we knew less about how to treat people, but it was quite clearly not affecting everyone the same. But still within digital contact tracing, these four assumptions organized the movement to push for adoption of these digital contact tracing apps. That there was a functional healthcare system in the background and everybody could access it was just part of the design that the designers of the exposure notification schema did not have to tend to. That everyone was equal at risk justified suggesting that the most important way of managing a pandemic was to get an app on everybody's phone. No particular recognition that not everyone has their own phone. That people could self-quarantine and those that needed help could just turn to whomever was in their family to be able to care for them. And then lastly, the assumption that you would be able to continue your work from home and that your own economic needs would not be affected or would be negligible. So you wouldn't need some approach that would support you moving in and out of the public. All four of these assumptions proved deadly for the pandemic. We are in the state we are in because we refuse to be able to see the social dynamics and components of this pandemic. So the promises and peril of scaling the pandemic technology of digital contact tracing fall to the realities of many people in the United States not sure if they will even use such technologies. It makes it possible for those within the tech sector to suggest, well, maybe people just don't understand what it is that we've built. But by and large, the continued mantra of just continue to get this contact tracing software out there drove for many, many months into the pandemic a focus financially on building out these contact tracing apps. They seem to be failing even as states were adopting these technologies. And for the most part, it was because states, just like the federal government, didn't have the key components. They didn't have a functioning public health system that could be accessible to everyone. They didn't have the trust of most people who otherwise felt uncomfortable with their institutions, whether that's a local hospital or going to their own, or the lack of being able to go to their own primary care physician. And they deeply, deeply underestimated how much there was a need to translate, quite literally translate, the information about the need for both contact tracing, but also about the pandemic into more languages than English. So for the most part, we had a patchwork of states left to be able to make decisions about whether they thought exposure notification was going to be an effective route to be able to manage their state's population. with very little discussion of what other technological systems needed to be built up, actually really needed to be rethought to be able to manage the other pieces of a functional approach to a pandemic, testing, and being able to have people supported in quarantine are the other key components of managing a pandemic. We focused on one piece, telling people they might be sick, or telling somebody more accurately who was healthy who they should avoid. So I want to suggest that, and I hope that the research that I've been doing for the past several months with colleagues at Microsoft Research are a challenge to an effort to scale technology. If we've learned anything from digital contact tracing as a case of the fallibility, but really the hubris of technology to assume that it can scale beyond a setting and ignore the realities that might be structuring whether people adopt technology or leave them by the wayside, then I hope that this project focuses on what I'm referring to as scaffolding of technology, building for a community-driven approach to, in this case, healthcare. But I hope it becomes a model for thinking through how could we approach software development particularly, but technology more broadly as a shared responsibility, a mutual responsibility between those who can build technologies and distribute them, and the societal actors who will always be impacted by what is built. So let me tell you a bit about the project that I've been working on. This is a collaboration with community healthcare workers in North Carolina. We're calling them the Community Health Tech Coalition. Colleagues Daniel Feldman, Calvin Leung, Catherine Lowe, and myself, and a group of engineers at Microsoft Research who have come together to try and identify what are the tools and the toolkits that community healthcare workers would need to be able to manage the pandemic on the ground. We're working with a number of organizations in North Carolina. We're using interviews, unstructured and structured, focus groups, collaborations, co-design, many of the techniques that are probably familiar to the Community Data Clinic and to others at Illinois, but that are novel inside a large tech company. For the most part, what we're looking at is what does it mean to be building for this size of organization, independent organizations that can range from one person who's serving the social determinants of health of particular communities to larger organizations that are trying to provide a range of service to multiple communities. In most cases, software development, particularly that's been commercialized, is built for large institutions that have the power to distribute technologies from the top down, or they're built for and by the public sector. And in many cases, the defunding of the public sector has meant a series of contractors who are part of feeding the building out of these different systems and the maintenance of legacy systems. These are the two models we have for developing systems that serve society's needs. When there are commercial incentives, for the most part, these actors are left out of the picture. They can't afford the technologies that are the customer relations management software that was used in many of the contact tracing efforts of states, nor can they afford to have the seats of large firms, the seats of software like large firms control when they're enterprise clients of large tech companies like mine. So they're left to their own devices. And certainly every one of these organizations was making do when we met them. They were putting together a collection of Google Docs and Airtable and Slack to be able to meet their needs for managing clients' requests and at the same time coordinate with each other. So it's pretty clear from COVID that healthcare systems are overlooking the folks that these community-based organizations serve. They're overlooking anyone who needs care. You could argue that has everything to do with the fact that the United States, one of the only countries that can afford to do so, has decided it does not provide universal health care. That would be too easy to suggest that that is the only problem. I would like to argue that universal health care is necessary, but not sufficient. Because what we need to recognize is how many people turn to their communities of trust. That might be families, but in most cases that means neighborhoods, and that also means communities of identity as the places where they find information and care that they feel they can rely on. So in all cases, we're always going to have those folks like these community-based organizations in the most important position on the ground, interfacing and interacting with those who need care. They are the actors who need to be equipped with the healthcare systems that to date have been built for public hospitals, private caregivers, and for large systems collecting data on health. These are the trusted the partners who create a bridge for these marginalized communities. So as one of the community healthcare administrators we talked with, quote, when you have someone who's been in these situations, the same as the folks you're talking to, they feel the desperation, the loss, they know what it's like to not know what to do. It makes a difference to be coming from that perspective. As this person noted, they've been there, they've been the person on the phone. Those are the people we want to equip with the technologies they need to be able to manage the data and trust of the people who are coming to them with health crises. They're doing this work on a deeply human level through relationship building. And the pandemic, not out of anyone's desire, has forced these community-based organizations to collaborate and cooperate more closely with each other than they ever have before. They keep these clients at the center of their work, but they're also, again, because of necessity, creating these networks of community partnership. It's entirely possible that once the pandemic's urgency subsides, there will be no impetus to have these organizations that otherwise are tacit competitors. Sometimes they're frenemies in settings that have limited funds to give out to community-based organizations, where they're often vying with each other for grant dollars. There will be very little incentive for them to cooperate. The one thing we're hoping to be able to show them and provide for them are technologies that make their cooperation a bit easier, to show them the value in staying connected after the pandemic, because they have been able to salvage on the ground the shards of people's lives and help them be able to find food, housing, connect with employment. They are the ones who are doing the lion's share of work to keep the fabric of their communities stitched together. They're providing wellness on wheels through both opportunities to get food, but also to get vaccines. And as many of us are hearing today, vaccine equity is driven quite literally by these community groups. So over the next several months, we're going to be working with these organizations as they roll out vaccines to groups that have been left behind. Not because they're vaccine deniers, but because they literally would have to take a bus for 3 hours to be able to get their first shot. And if they, once they did get that shot, needed to find a second shot, they'd have to find public transit again to get a second shot. There are millions of people in this position who are not able to rely on a Twitter bot to be able to set them up for a vaccine. So in this case, these organizations, there are 12 participating, are going out to different communities to be able to connect them both with appointments, but in many cases, vials of vaccine, and at the same time be able to ask them, do they need other help? Food and food insecurity have defined this pandemic. So finding those folks who need basics to be able to support themselves if they get sick, and to be able to take care of their families if one of their members of the family gets sick is critical to being able to manage this disease. That is the reality of any pandemic. So these organizations are bringing the resources to people rather than waiting or asking people to show up in locations that are far away or that are foreign to them. The tools to support this work have never been built for these organizers. As one community healthcare worker told us, they just throw software out there. They say, this is what we came up with because this is what you needed. And we say, we don't need any of that. And in fact, in other conversations, they're quite clear that depending on who's handing them the software, they may just say, thanks, because what they're looking for is the possibility of a future connection, of some resource that might make a difference. But they're never asked to inform what should be built. They're told that they may not know what they need, and therefore adapting the systems that are already out there is their best bet. So let me share with you one insight from what we're learning to be able to set the table for the next part of the conversation. It's really clear that community organizations that are providing healthcare right now on the ground are working at two levels. They're either providing case-centric care, connecting people with different resources, they're helping people navigate benefits, they're informally counseling people, they're helping people file insurance claims, but they're also quite service-centric. So they're doing more in their communities to build out how to move on from just the immediate direct care of case-centric care provision, to be able to think about how can they intervene for people who are chronically undernourished, who are chronically marginalized by systems of oppression, that are effectively the recipients of all of these technologies that literally don't see them because they're not paying customers. In this case, we're thinking about service-centric care like a vaccine clinic. So as this interviewee notes, they are trying to go into communities to meet them where they are because they may not have transportation or what have you. It's about going where the consumers of this need are. And they treat them as clients that absolutely may need them today, but if they're doing their best work, the goal is that they aren't clients in the future. It's dealing with the reality that people who are chronically marginalized by our systems are often turning to these community-based organizations as a first and sometimes a last hope. So in thinking about service-centered care, like a vaccine clinic, you can see that one of the enablers for the community healthcare workers is their preparation, their connection to local groups, from churches to local employers to families that are change makers in their own communities. And then they'll take this preparation of already being embedded in their communities, and they will bring that to any event that they organize. So they'll call on pastors to be able to broker an event, be able to convene an event. They'll connect with people and bring information to those events with the assumption that they're going to be skeptics and they need to be familiar and quite literally fluent enough in the conversations that people are having to be able to be effective. Their ability to be those, what we're calling subject matter experts, is critical to the success of any of these events, and they are the infrastructure that make success possible. A pain point for all these community healthcare workers was documentation. They easily spend 3 to 4 hours for each event trying to gather together all of the information that they put down on paper, because they know that if they were entering it into a system, they either wouldn't be able to hold on to that information because they don't own the systems that collect the data. Those systems are typically legacy systems owned by public health, owned by hospitals, or they're going to be in the position of perhaps writing down information like somebody's name or location that could put them at greater risk if they are, for example, an undocumented worker, or they're somebody who might be fleeing violence from their own homes. So they will take the extra step to protect people's identities and put it on paper on a third spreadsheet or somewhere where it's going to be less connected to the identity of somebody they're working with, because they don't have systems, technological systems that they can trust, that have been built with the assumption that there is a need to be able to keep people's identities thoroughly disconnected from the details of what provisions they've received. But that documentation is also something that could benefit everyone if it could be secured. So putting the CHWs in the position of not being able to report who they've worked with, because we assume that information should only be collected by the government or held by the government, or worse, become a commercial product, puts us all at a disadvantage. And then a second pain point to point out is that in many ways, the data that could be aggregated across all these locations to give us a much better picture of where we need to allocate resources is lost to us, because there's no way for these individual organizations to be able to connect with each other and share data, to be able to see the metrics they collectively could apply to have a better sense of where are their needs, how would they fill those gaps and address the holes in the fabric of care. So as one of our participants noted, if she didn't set up her spreadsheets correctly, she's got to go back through them. And for instance, last year they served 500 clients. Imagine going through 500 documents to get that information. That's insane. They are spending that time precisely because there is no system built with the assumption that an independent organization might be cooperating with other independent organizations and serving as trust of data for individual clients who do not have access or a way of paying for the care for their data, let alone for themselves. So we're arguing that the ability of community healthcare workers to provide this care sits in this larger set of relationships that they're managing. All of these actors care about individuals' health. And I should be the first to point out, we talked with doctors and nurses and other caregivers and public officials who clearly care about the citizens in their neighborhoods, the residents of their neighborhoods who aren't able to get care. At the individual level, we all care. But that's not enough. Systemic oppression, systemic racism in the case of the United States isn't something any one individual will ever overcome. That's why abstraction is so dangerous, because it means we're not paying attention to the details that quite literally are killing us. And in the case of community healthcare workers, they are in the best position to be able to balance out the ambitions of everyone to be able to provide care, whether that's funders who put money on the table or healthcare entities, the traditional centers of power of where people receive health, or community partners who are larger, like the civic society actors we met in public governments, who all have a role to play, but are often unwilling to give up or share power with community-based organizations that typically look like the clients they're serving. So these system dynamics, these power dynamics, these inequities in power are part of what shows us the inequities and the manifestation of abstraction in the software that community healthcare workers are using. They're asked to use many portals, but they're often trying to basically fill a single purpose. It's often to be able to document the care somebody's received and to be able to understand, are they going to need something later? So they're filling this gap right now with myriad spreadsheets. And our goal is to build something that speaks to their need to both have a range of ways of reporting their activity, but also support their workflows and protect the data of the people that they're working with. We believe that we could grow their impact if there was a home for their data. And I would be the first to say, I think that any large tech company will likely fail at this endeavor. But my hope is that the goal here is that we're showing that there needs to be an approach that recognizes the importance and the responsibility of those building technologies to those who are going to need to use them. That particularly when it comes to solving social problems, we can no longer live in abstractions. We can no longer seek scale that jets past the realities of people's lives. So we're working on building this together. The success of this tool is to be determined. And my talk's going to end very soon here because I want to point us to what I hope, what I see in scaffolding, which I'm drawing from the work of Vladimir Vygotsky, thinking about what it means to learn from each other and quite literally hold each other accountable for learning, that could move us toward a theory of mutuality in computer science. So what could a theory of mutuality look like? And I've benefited greatly from talking with my colleagues, Angel Christian and Rita Quadri, about the lack of a theory of power in computer science, a tacit assumption that technologies just work. And if they're built well, they'll work better. So we're thinking about this question of the tacit theory of power that puts technology at the center of things, effectively derailing us from seeing a theory of mutuality. So technology alone is never going to be able to create systemic change. We have to stop thinking about technologies as somehow a solution. We're not going to build a solution. We can build technologies that foster the relationships, that can be the tools that facilitate the connections, that can move us toward a tentative, a possible retreat or a way of addressing our pain. We can't succeed or somehow win the day with technologies. We don't overcome inequality that way either. There's no single act of creating equity. It is a constant act, a constant process of calling ourselves out for how we complicitly circulate the power that disenfranchises others to the benefit of ourselves. So my argument in thinking about scaffolding is precisely that it could be an approach that reckons with power differentials rather than denies them. And here I'm inspired by the work of Ruha Benjamin, certainly Sasha Costanza-Chock. Anybody who reaches out to me, I'll say at the end, I'm happy to give you the citations that are on my mind. My thought here is to say that scaffolding expertise becomes an explicit way of mapping out who can be in service to others. What is the mutuality that we can provide? Subject matter expertise is critical, and it's been completely absent in most technology builds. In our case, it's the community healthcare workers and the community-based organizations and the clients themselves, whom we haven't spoken with, who are the subject matter experts in their lives. They know exactly what the problems are that they are trying to solve. And in fact, they already know how to manage them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. So we need to learn what are the ways they are making do. What are the ways that we want to build with the relationships and the support structures they've put in place. To do that, I would argue the role that different disciplinary domain experts have to play, people like me, people like you, if you're a student or a faculty member or a staff person working at the University of Illinois or Urbana-Champaign, Champaign-Urbana, sorry. If you're a sociologist or historian or anyone who has something to contribute to the conversation of a particular problem, then our role can be to be both bridges and power brokers, to transfer power, the power that we have to analyze and to comparatively move across sites, to be able to connect with subject matter experts and to be able to draw out and draw together what are the ways in which the problems they are working on either have a common thread that we can pull, or more importantly, are quite distinct and require an appreciation and a respect for that difference, particularly if it's around identity. So disciplinary domain expertise is not a matter of stepping aside. And please note, nor do I think it's about a technical expertise. We all have technical expertise. It's precisely to be able to have the training and the rigor to pay attention, to listen to the subject matter experts who are acting on their own behalf and have the resilience to manage their day-to-day. And a third layer of expertise, and I would argue not the least important, but the expertise that should not be driving any of the ideation of what should be built, are computer scientists and technologists, software developers, designers, HCI experts, data scientists, security experts. They have the domain expertise that comes from computer science that helps understand what are the material constraints that come with the immaterial realities of software development. That has to include a reality check that none of us operate outside of capital. None of us can imagine that we can, for very long, put at bay all of the market logics that drive the development of technology. There's no outside of technology development in a capitalist market logic, and particularly a racialized capitalist logic. When we accept that reality, that means we can be co-conspirators. We can figure out from what position can we work to override and challenge, thwart the mechanisms in place that perpetuate systemic marginalization. Technologies will always be a part of that picture, and it's accepting that reality, sitting with that truth that can push us all toward mutuality, can push us toward constantly checking on what are the things that we believe are our priorities, where do we have conflicts of interest, what are our commitments, and how will we continue to struggle in the place we are to move a problem forward, not without an awareness of what the problems are we're trying to solve, but with humility, with a kind of deep check on our own capacity to create change as individuals. So with that, I want to thank the Just Infrastructures organizers and the sponsors for giving me the time to talk through this project. As I said, I'm happy to share the sites with you. Please reach out to me. I'll also post the references on my own website. And I want to thank my thinkers and doers at Microsoft Research and for all the feedback on the talk that I've given to you today. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Mary. Thank you so much. We now have some time for audience questions. You can send us your questions via the Q&A box, and Kara Halios and I will moderate that and get to your questions. And I will read aloud our first question from the audience, which comes to us from David Musulman, who asks, does the structural inequity of digital contact tracing reflect a process where developers are building tools for themselves and people like them, rather than being representative of the audience who would benefit from digital contact tracing? And to what extent is it shaped by a situation where fixing structural healthcare needs is just too hard or out of scope for the IT sector?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's imagining that it's out of scope to address the absolute divestment in public health care in the United States, that is the beginning of the problem. So I completely agree. Part of exposure notification and the schema that assumed I don't really have to think about anything other than individuals with phones implicitly is thinking about very particular individuals with phones. It's any person in tech. So it's absolutely symptomatic of a tendency for those within the tech sector to start with, what is a problem I have? How would I solve it for me or my friends? Or projecting out what problem somebody else might have. I will imagine what their problem is, without any point at the very beginning stopping that impulse to say, I actually don't know enough about this problem, and having to do more than a little weekend reading to figure it out. I'll say one more thing about that, though, which is it's not about just mustering a new set of people around a draft table. And I think there's an important, necessary, but insufficient step, which is, yes, we absolutely have to diversify who is participating in the tech sector. That is not enough. That is why I would make this case for the need for different kinds of expertise in a very methodical, rigorous way being applied to social problems.
The next question is by James Hay. Yes, Mary, you make scalability in the US seem simply a matter of responsibility for big tech or local nonprofit communitarianism, and worse, personal responsibility. This is a long question, by the way. So what historical conditions have brought us to the brokenness of the possibilities of national and local scalability that you are describing? How to understand in that sense the assumption folly of the Google Apple initiative in 2020, after years of those companies elaborating self-tracking tech for a particular lifestyle cluster, or the arrival of Trumpian libertarianism and federalism that have resulted in the state schisms and civil warfare over testing masks and passports. How, in other words, can we address the political and governmental rationality shaping scalability and scaffolding?
Let me start with the end of that question, because I think the way to address it is, what does it look like for us to fund public needs? And at the core of why digital contact tracing fails, we have to be particular about where did it fail. It failed in the United States for very different reasons than how it stumbled in places like Singapore. So a country like Singapore was able, through mostly authoritarian means, require everybody to have an app to be able to be notified, but it also provides universal health care. So looking at the very particular geopolitical conditions under which something like a technology is applied is a critical part of this step. In the United States, we divested from public health in the 80s, really beginning in the 70s. We decided that that was a commercial market and that the needs of publics were better served by markets. That market logic, that neoliberal, it's one of the few times I'll ever use that phrase because it's become it's ubiquitous. It's how we organize the nation state, is through a divestment of public dollars for public needs, because there's a fundamentalism that's driven most of the way we organize, which is a sense that the markets are the best source of success. So our biggest problem is certainly looking at the ways in which, and I would hope the pandemic shows us, the incapacity for us to serve a public need through market logics. That's easy to say, but how do we undo many, many years of that divestment? We could certainly turn towards labor organizing. In the United States, we have so few of us, including our universities, actively organizing on behalf of workers as a way of getting healthcare. My dream would be that we would see it as a fundamental right. I shouldn't have to be attached to a particular workplace to have healthcare, for example. So when we look at the case of healthcare technologies, it's always a good point. We can pull a thread and see how is an approach that is fundamentally about consuming um, boiling us all. And these are those moments, like what can we identify as spaces that capital can be allowed to survive if we want that? And I do want that. I'd be the first to say there are things that capital brings us that are comforts. And how do we check it? How do we check those comforts? How do we think about a kind of coexistence? Because I feel I'm a pragmatist. I can't see the day where we won't be fighting commercial interests for public goods. So recognizing that and finding a middle path that for me isn't about leaving it to community groups. It's precisely seeing community groups are a source of not just inspiration, but clarity. How do folks who can't afford nor have ever been considered by commercial markets get by? What does that look like? Because that defines most of the world.
Our next question comes from Aishani Duda, who says, "Hi, Dr. Gray. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the efficacy of mutual aid networks that expanded throughout the pandemic, particularly in the case of mutual aid networks and donation threads among strangers facilitated by social media, quote unquote strangers. Do you think this could be an example of scale technology working to undo systems of oppression, economic inequality, and where might it fall short?"
Yeah, let me start again with the end of the question. Where would it fall short is if we believe there is something magical, and I'm very glad there was an air quote to stranger, that there's something that the technologies are doing. Because in most cases, when we're looking, and I agree, I'm fascinated by the kind of mutual aid that popped up. In many ways, that's mutual aid that's just there in places that have limited resources. So how did we see mutual aid pop up in middle-class neighborhoods is an interesting question. But we would be fooling ourselves if we didn't think about the infrastructure of the neighborhood, the infrastructure of home ownership, the infrastructure of our streets and roads and different kinds of built infrastructures that were shaping where people placed, the community fridge. So looking at those details, and this is why I think having the domain expertise of science technology studies, of other disciplines that look at those details, gives us an idea of how would we build more possibilities? How would we learn from those moments and not ever see them scale? Because scale erases the texture of what we're actually doing in a Criticonian way. Like, what is it that we are doing? And to me, the real power moving forward is being able to learn from what is it that people are doing, and to be able to see those relationships as the most important infrastructure towards justice.
The next question is from Shami Yang. Do you have a response to the ongoing narrative surrounding contact tracing that often focus on protecting user privacy? Are these narratives helpful for your work? And how would you respond to the advocates of privacy and AI ethicists who often frame the problem as a matter of individual choice and preference and help them move beyond it?
I'm glad, thank you for that question, because I also want to connect it to the other, the spirit of the last question of thinking about individualism and individual action and rights as this fulcrum. Because I think one of the things that studying the failure of digital contact tracing can tell us is that the sense that the problem was privacy didn't understand what needed to happen next. What needed to happen was building trust. If somebody's sick, they need to trust somebody enough that they'll tell somebody. They need to trust somebody enough that they will let somebody bring them groceries. It's a terribly vulnerable position. But we already have identified who we trust in our day-to-day lives. And some people have to do that under duress. So to me, that I love this question, because I think I find it, whenever somebody raises privacy for privacy's sake, or some sense that privacy is an obvious inherent quality that transcends how people construct their sense of confidentiality, or their own sense of withdrawal. we're missing a chance to think about the organizing principle for most of what I'm arguing here is trust. How would we build trust? And I think it's unfortunate. And actually, this is another piece of the writing that I'm doing right now. If we look at what are the default ethics of computer science and engineering, the place it often moved to was privacy and security. As long as I take care of the data, I'm doing my job. And that impulse and later the legal obligation to protect and defend data meant I didn't have to pay attention to the person producing it. I just had to make sure no one ever found out who they were. I can't think of a worse starting point for a social problem, to not care about who is producing the information I'm learning from. So if we actually stop thinking about data as something to protect and move to a paradigm that I'm hoping comes with scaffolding and mutuality that presumes my accountability is not privacy or security, but fostering trust and knowing who's producing data and ultimately beholding their needs above my needs to use data, even if it's refusal to let me use the data, that we will be on a better path than we are right now.
Our next question, thank you, Mary, that was great. It comes from Swetha Garg, who asks, you mentioned that an example of being colorblind is that the system is trying to protect healthy people from sick people instead of taking care of sick people so that they can get better and get access to basic amenities. Can being colorblind actually also be intentional though? For example, intentionally excluding certain races or ethnicities by design?
Actually, I think it's more pernicious when it's, what has maybe more contemporarily been called implicit bias. I actually don't like that framing at all because it removes how systemic it is for all of us to be made less aware of our privilege. So I don't know that intentionality helps us with this argument. And in fact, in some ways, this is from a rant, it's important perhaps to see that the lack of attention is the problem. So when I unintentionally do something, colorblindness is an interesting example. When I presume everybody's the same and therefore the best thing I can do is treat everybody the same, we are denying the very humanity of most of the people around us. And I think that can be an intentional act. I think in many cases, most of us are just not taught. And quite literally, I think it is a way of being taught to see others and to see difference as something that I'm not trying to absorb into me, but that I'm trying to reckon with. Like that feels like the most important thing we can take from difference is not how to eradicate it, but how to work with it, and to acknowledge how hard that is. So it's interesting because I'm going to think more about your question. I feel like there's something about intentions that can often lead us to probably what I think are not the right set of questions to ask.
Next question is by Ashley Buckley. As a social worker at a nonprofit consumer healthcare organization, the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers, the issue we face with our software is that it's not as customizable or easily accessible as Google Sheets for initial contact with the client. There's a gap between the high level of demographic information needed for grants to run our specific programs and the ability of the programs on the market to house and process that information is lacking. Grants are ever-changing requirements, and to send a ticket to a request update to our system may take 2 to 3 days. In that time, we've fallen back on Google Sheets. Will the software being developed help close the gaps in real-time changes and the complexity of our program requirements?
I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, the software we're developing is open source software. It'll be released in 2 weeks, and just email me and I'll let you know how you can find it. I've think one of the most important findings from this research is that building open source software without a sense of how will it be tended to is one of the greatest challenges facing community-based organizations that want to own and control their data and the technologies they use for that data management. The last thing I'll say is that, this issue, I've been in conversations where folks just kind of like shake their hands and like really wish that grant makers didn't demand reports. That would solve everything. And when you say that to a community-based organizer, they often will smile at you like, that's not going away. So how do we confront the bureaucratic power move of asking people to show their homework? And I hope that one way to do that is to recognize that building systems that make that as easy as possible is one way, while we're working on challenging that power move. Like, can we do both at the same time? That's my hope. So I hope the software helps.
And we're now over time, and so that's unfortunately our last question. There were other questions. We thank all of our audience members for really sharing your questions with us. We'll make sure that Mary gets the list of questions. So thank you all again, and thank you again, Mary, for your generosity with the time and staying over with us and such an excellent talk and kickoff to the series. It was wonderful. And we couldn't think of a better kickoff to the series. So thank you, or address of such a timely set of topics. We also want to take a moment to thank our production team and invite them all to revideo. None of this would have been possible without the back end work of Mitchell Oliver, Jing Yu, Gabe Mallow, Jorge Rojas, Sam Walkow, Tiffany Lee, Vinay Koshi, and Adrian Wong. Thank you all. And it's also our ASL translators, Joe Campbell-Welch and Clint Labarge from UIUC's Dres office. Thank you. And thank you again to our audience for joining us here today. A recording of our talk will be posted to our website. Join us again for our next event with Fernanda Villegas and Martin Wattenberg on September 29th. We hope to see you there. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Everyone.